Welcome to In Pursuit of Darkness, a detective's journey that reveals the terrifying depths of human darkness and violence through the lens of Michigan's most successful and prolific violent crime investigator. I'm your host, Michael Minzey, and together with my father, David Minzey, we recount the investigations of Michigan's most terrifying and violent crimes. Involved in over 10,000 violent crime investigations, he is a retired Michigan State Police detective, former manager of the Michigan State Police Violent Crimes Unit, and an expert criminal profiler. His relentless pursuit of justice brought him face to face with some of the most heinous killers, rapists, and violent offenders. These are his stories in Pursuit of Darkness. Thank you for joining, Dan.
Well, thanks for having me.
Today, we are going to be talking about a case from 1991 that rocked the quiet area of Southwest Michigan. On a cold February evening, prominent 34-year-old TV news anchorwoman Diane Newton was gunned down in the driveway of her country home in Marshall, Michigan. Still in their mother's car, the son and infant daughter were the only witnesses. This was a huge case back in the early 90s in Michigan, and it starts out with a very violent beginning. Can you give us some context around the body and how it was found? And then let's talk about maybe some of the events leading up to murder.
Yes, this case involved a newscaster who was very popular in the Battle Creek area of Michigan, and she was found lying next to her car, the victim of a gunshot wound. She would be considered a very unlikely candidate to be a murder victim in a county that does not have many violent crimes.
And so how were the authorities notified to the murder? How did the EMTs or the emergency get called to the scene?
Well, the call was actually received on a non-recorded line to the local police dispatch, which is unusual. Most everybody today uses 911, and those lines are recorded. This call to the unrecorded line was somewhat unusual, but the dispatch people treated it just like they would any other emergency and dispatched not only the police, but also the medical response team as well.
Okay, and so where did this call come from?
Well, it came from the farmhouse of the victim, and this is out in the country, of course, in an area that really has very little crime, and what crime they might have tends to be property crime. You know, somebody hits your mailbox with a baseball bat, something like that, steals something off of your bed porch, but to be gunned down on a farmhouse in a county that does not have those type of crimes was very unusual.
Okay, and do we know who made that call to this unrecorded business line of the police?
Yes, we do. It was the victim's husband, who had been a police officer for 9 years, and he made this call, and in fact, the dispatchers reported that he was quite hysterical when he was calling them. They could only make out that he needed help for his wife, and that was the information that was passed along to the police units that were responding.
Okay, so when the husband is making this call, he's hysterical. He finds his wife in the driveway, shot, but he's unable to articulate what he's observed?
That's correct. The best that the dispatcher could get was that this individual was calling and needed help for his wife. And so the police officers were really dispatched to an unknown problem involving a female.
Interesting. So what happens when the police and ambulance show up? What do they find?
Well, when the first police car pulled in, they were surprised that the caller was not outside with his wife. In fact, he was seen standing in the house and was waving his arms, reportedly frantically, to the police. But even though they had responded, he stayed in the house. He did not come out to be with his wife.
That seems pretty interesting.
It's interesting, yeah, but not totally unusual. When something like that happens, there really is no playbook for how people are supposed to act. They all act differently to different situations. So it was something that the police found a little unusual, that this hysterical person was now frantically waving his arms, but didn't come out to be with his wife.
So was there any indication at the onset about why she would have been?
No, there wasn't. The only thing that popped up right away was as a newscaster, and she was a very attractive female, and they do get phone calls and they do get letters from people that, have different reasons for contacting them. She did get a call at work that said, an individual wanted to get involved in the news business, and he offered to even take her to lunch. And she, of course, refused. But that really was the only intro to this. There really had been no overt acts against her at the station. There had been a few hang-up calls. But other than that, she would be considered a very low-risk victim.
So right at the onset, there is no clear indication that she would have been a target for violent crime.
Right, and that's a big leap to come from, I want to take you to lunch, to get into the news business, to actually committing a murder. That really would not solve the caller's desire. Probably the next step would be to go to the station and see if you could meet her. But this was totally opposite of that. This was an assassination, basically.
So the husband is there. He's the one that places the call to this non-recorded business line of emergency departments. What is the context for his behavior, involvement? He's at the house. His wife has been murdered, but he's calling and says that she needs help, right? Like, he wasn't even saying that she's been shot or that she's been murdered. He's saying my wife needs help. What is the context for the husband in this case?
Well, that's an interesting question. When investigators went inside to talk to him, they found his behavior to be unusually calm. And the police didn't know at that point that the victim had been shot. And it really wasn't until the emergency medical people arrived that they discovered that. But there was something about his behavior that just seemed a little unusual to the first police officers who had arrived there. He was very, very calm.
So they have to be asking, him, where were you at in all of this? What was his story for that?
Well, that's exactly the first step that you would take in any murder case involving a wife or a girlfriend. You have to start from that person and work your way out. So husbands, boyfriends, at the very least, they need to be cleared before you can move on to something else. But he maintained that he had been at the farm all day long, hadn't seen anybody, hadn't heard anybody, and had gone for a walk around the farm property there. And that's when he returns that he discovers his wife laying next to the car.
And so he calls the non-recorded police line.
Right. Again, that's not out of the question, but unusual. Somebody who's hysterical and frantic would be much more likely to call 911. But in this case, the call went to an unrecorded line.
Okay, so can you give us a little bit around that initial investigation? I imagine that first 24 hours, lots of resources are brought in to understand what the heck is going on. And, I guess maybe preface that with, we assume that she was pronounced dead at the scene. Did she go back to the hospital? What happened after that call?
Well, after the call and the police response, the one thing you need to do is to look around and see if there's any evidence, one way or the other, that could prove or disprove what the crime is all about. She was clearly dead at the scene. In fact, she'd not been shot once, but twice. And so, you call people in, detectives in. They also had a canine officer brought in to see if they could verify where the husband had walked. You'd find, whatever path he took. And to see, if there are any other things, witnesses. In this case, it's out in the country, so there were none. But the one thing you need to do is start looking at this case and see what you can find to prove or disprove someone's involvement.
So when the police show up, so they obviously realize this is something much larger, and they need to call in detectives, forensics, etc. They do that, right? And that's what kicks off kind of this immediate investigation on the scene. So what's all happening in that first 24 hours?
Well, one thing is, as the case evolved, when the police first get there, they didn't know she'd been shot. It could have been a medical emergency of some sort. But at that point, it wasn't until the medical people arrived that they found out that she'd been shot. Well, that changes the whole investigation from a potential heart attack or some other medical emergency to now we've got a homicide. And that usually triggers a response of those who are specialties, the detectives, canine unit, people from crime labs, people who can collect evidence. All those people are brought to bear on a case like this.
So obviously you know a lot about this case, but just so the audience is aware, and we'll talk about the whole investigation, but you are not in a part of the investigation yet. Is that?
That's correct.
You are not brought in till much later, and we'll get into that.
Yes.
So following that first 24 hours where the initial detectives and forensics and specialty units are brought in, where does the investigation go from there? Because obviously they know this is a murder and this is not an accidental or heart attack or something like that. Where does the investigation go from?
Well, the investigation then begins to evolve as a homicide investigation. This takes on a great deal of information, basically, that they appeal to the public. They have to get all of the news media, and because it involved a newscaster, this overnight became a national murder investigation. And you have a victim here who clearly was on her way up. I think she had plans to go nationally in terms of her news reporting. But once you get the detectives involved, and you have to wait, of course, you can't do things like they do on TV where you immediately get fingerprint analysis or try to figure out where the bullet came from, where the weapon came from. There's a lot of basically just kind of start from the beginning and work your way out. So you start with the victim, and in the first 24 hours, you need to find as much as you can as to where she was coming from. And of course, we know that her two small children were in the back seat. In the first 24 hours, I think it's learned that the children were not anticipating being at home, that it appears that the victim and her husband we're going to use the time to maybe talk about some of the issues that they were having at the time.
So do we know the victim, the wife, returned home? How long had she been gone? And it sounds like maybe her arrival was a little bit unexpected. Do we have any context around that?
Yes, it wasn't unusual that she would go visit her mother who lived in the Detroit area, over an hour away drive time. But she was coming back. She'd stayed at her mother's house for more than a day, I believe. And so her coming back was likely unknown to anybody other than her husband. And it was not unusual that she went and stayed with her mother. It was supposed to be the plan that the two children would stay with their grandmother while she returned home to talk to her husband.
So was there anything in the investigation that popped up before the murder that might have given some insight into why she would?
Yes, there was. Of course, we talked about this phone call that she got at work from a guy who wanted to get into the news business and wanted to take her to lunch. And again, she refused, of course. And there were a few hang-up calls, but all of those came at work. And then her husband told her that he had received some hang-up calls at their home. But then one day, a letter showed up in her mailbox, and the letter inside was not handwritten. It was made from small letters cut out of a magazine that were put into a letter format that said, "You should have had lunch with me." Well, this now opens up the possibility that we have some kind of a obsessed fan, a stalker perhaps, and the most frightening thing to her was that this person knew where she lived. And in addition to that, her husband had told her that somebody had apparently tried to break into their house. He'd found some broken glass. And he also told her that there was one night when she wasn't there that he heard somebody outside of the house. So all these things begin to point to potentially an obsessed fan, stalker type information. So the investigation kind of tips in that direction for a while.
This is probably at the beginning of the investigation, I presume. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's where the investigation takes off first. And so the investigation into this murder actually began with that phone call that she received at work. And that kind of focused the investigation on this unknown individual who may be stalking her.
In your experience, these kinds of letters, what do you do with that? I mean, is this something that happens a lot? I mean, where do you go from here as an investigator with, your typical movie letter of newspaper letter?
That's correct. And I can tell you that in my career involving hundreds of cases where a letter such like that has come to bear on a victim, it usually comes from either someone known to the victim or from the victim themselves. I have never found one that came from a stranger. You see it in the movie, you see it on TV a lot, but I've never found one that it actually came from someone unknown to the victim. That's Hollywood.
So basically, the reason that those letters look like that is because the person is connected to the victim and they're trying to obfuscate their handwriting or their language to make it seem like it's a stranger, right?
Yeah, and that's the fear, is that someone would recognize your handwriting or your printing. And you can try to change that, but it's almost impossible to totally change your handwriting. There are certain things you do just mechanically from the way that you've developed a printer or writing your handwriting, something like that. That's almost impossible to hide all of that. So when you do get a letter with the small letters cut out of a magazine or out of the newspaper, it comes from somebody extremely close, or in many cases from the victim themselves.
So that strategy almost has the opposite effect, right? It's meant to mean that it's someone like a stranger or someone anonymous, but in reality, it's only a further indication that it's someone that's close.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So this happened, maybe within a few weeks before her murder?
Yeah, well, we don't really know exactly when some of the hang-up calls came. Again, she was very attractive. She was a local celebrity, very active in the community, particularly when it came to volunteer work. So her exposure to a great many people, either in public or, on the air every morning as the news anchor, really opened this thing up initially. But now we're talking about something probably very close to the victim herself.
So what other investigative strategies were taken in the following weeks?
Well, one thing you need to do is, to verify the information that you have already. The husband said that he went for a walk, and this big circle came right back to his driveway. Well, initially, they believed that there were footprints that headed in that direction and then came down the road and then back into the driveway. And when they brought in a canine officer to see if that track was what was left by him, they found out that that's where the dog went. It appeared that he was telling the truth. But in an investigation, quite often, you have to go back and just look at things a little bit differently. And that's what they did. And the canine then, they followed that track, and, a couple days later, they go out there and look, and here's this small creek that went through the property. And sticking out of that creek was the butt of a rifle. The water level had dropped a few inches as the gun had been just barrel first shoved down into the creek. When the water level went down, there was the butt of that rifle sticking out of it.
That's amazing. And what did they find about that rifle?
Well, that rifle was ultimately determined to be the murder weapon.
And what's the time frame between this discovery and the murder?
It was only a few days later, but you have to begin to start asking yourself some questions. If this was a stranger, this was an obsessed fan of some sort, why would that person risk taking that rifle back onto the property? Why wouldn't they just leave by the road, or, however they got there, probably parked down the road a bit? But this person really would up the risk potential by staying on the property for a period of time. It would take some time to walk and to put that weapon in this creek and then continue to walk around back to the road. That really would raise their risk potential, and that's unusual. Usually if somebody commits a crime like this, the first thing they want to do is that fight or flight. They want to get the heck out of there.
And certainly they want to take all their evidence with them.
Oh, absolutely.
Wow. So we know now that the murder weapon is found. what do we find out about the weapon? Is there anything you can give us on, the forensics around that, or, how that led to the murder? Was there an owner, or?
Well, the husband said that he didn't have a .22 rifle, which was the murder weapon. However, investigators learned that that wasn't true, that people had seen him with that weapon years before, I believe, but they could basically corroborate the fact that he did have that weapon. And in addition to that, that weapon was found to have been used from the second story of the barn nearby.
And how was that determined?
Well, there was empty shell casings up there, and in reconstructing where the first bullet hit the victim, you could tell that it came in from a downward angle and went through her torso, and the only place that could come from would have been the barn. And to add maybe a little more interest to the story, there was a chained Doberman at the front door of that barn. So whomever did that would need to get by that Doberman, which would be unusual. Why would you risk getting through the barn upstairs when you probably, if your motivation was just to shoot killer, why would you go to all that trouble? It turns out that the dog wasn't very dangerous, but who would know that?
So we've established that at the scene of the crime, when the victim was shot, there was a dog outside, and the murder weapon was fired from the barn over the driveway at the victim.
That's correct.
Is there anything else about the shooting and the victim you think that plays into the story?
Oh, sure. Probably the most important aspect involving shooting the victim. I mean, she was clearly killed with a bullet that came from the second level of the barn. However, she was shot twice. The first one came from the barn. The second one was extremely close, probably contact close, and she was shot in the vagina, and that bullet traveled up her body, which indicated, of course, that she was on the ground when that second shot was fired, and that really puts you in the realm of somebody who is emotionally connected to the victim.
So the victim drove up into her driveway, got out of the car, was shot from the second story of her own barn, and then with the same weapon, someone had to have come down to the driveway and then basically point-blank range shot her in the vagina.
Well, that's correct. And maybe it's an important point to stress right now is that because of the letter, she was very concerned for her safety. So she and her husband had worked out a security measure where she would not get out of the car until she saw him. And we know that she did get out of the car. And if we follow their security procedure, she would have had to seen him.
So this is really starting to coalesce. So as this so now this is known by the investigation team that it sounds like the husband is now a suspect.
He sure pops up to the top. Yeah, I mean, he is clearly emotionally connected to her. It turns out that they were having some marital issues, and he claims that he was there all day, except for the fact that he went on this large walk. He still stayed on the property. So, here is a guy who used to be a police officer who says that he's there all day, which makes, a obsessed fan or a stalker much that, we're difficult because he's there.
Right. It seems highly circumstantial that he's home all day, he goes for a walk, and his wife is murdered while he's out.
Absolutely. And, the question becomes, who knew she was coming?
And do we know the answer to that?
Apparently, only he knew she was coming, and, of course, her grandmother, knew that she left and was heading back home.
So very few people in the planet knew that she would be arriving home at the time that she did. It's probably
that's correct. Yeah.
They did too, right?
And it's unlikely that her mother would be involved. But really the only one who fit all the categories, who knew that she was coming, knew about how long that it would take to get there. They had planned on getting together, and he's there all day. We don't have any other people who pop up into that equation.
So at this point, did the investigative team feel strongly that this letter writer, the phone call hanger, the person, the fan, was really even a viable suspect?
No, things began to melt away there for sure. And a lot was basically attributed to that phone call that she received at work. And if you start looking at the behavior, I mean, that doesn't even make sense. Here's a guy who really allegedly wants to get into the business, wants to meet her. And then, she's murdered. She's not raped. There is no robbery. The motivation, again, is that basically she was assassinated.
Right, because if there was any other motive, we would have seen evidence of other things, right?
Right.
I think you said it best, that this was an assassination.
Absolutely. An assassination by somebody who was emotionally connected to her, which comes from that second shot.
Because it wasn't just a double tap to make sure they're dead. This was a very emotionally motivated shot. I mean, I can't even imagine someone trying to take that kind of shot against someone. Shooting them in a sexual area. I mean, clearly that's something that has a very deep level of emotional attachment.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that is a good point to make, is that when you get something like that, assault to a sexual area, her vagina, for example, that now goes beyond just emotionally connected, that there's probably some kind of sexual connection as well.
So with that being said, is there anything about the husband that we know now that indicated that he would have this kind of motive?
Well, yeah, I mean, they were having marital problems. They were in counseling, but he had basically a part-time job as a CJ instructor at the local university, and was not making much money at all, but it put him in contact with a great many co-eds. And even following the murder, his behavior was that he spent more time on campus. I think he spent more time in a fraternity that he had belonged to when he was in college. He was hanging around at the bars. So, here's a guy who you would think, even though they were having trouble, would still have some kind of grief that they need to work through. And that just wasn't there.
So this husband, so the victim, his wife, was 31. He was probably in his 30s? Was he in his 40s?
I think he was in his 40s, yeah.
Okay, so we have this 40-year-old ex-police officer who's teaching criminal justice at Western Michigan. He's hanging around with a bunch of college kids, co-eds, guys, girls. It almost seems like a very emotionally immature kind of person. Is that accurate?
That's very accurate. And I think it wasn't brought up in the trial, but I think it did let the investigators know the kind of person that they were dealing with here.
Do we know, was he having any sort of affairs on the side that might have attributed to their marital issues?
There was a high probability, and I don't know that anybody really needed to, spend much more time than that. I think it was probably believed by investigators that, in fact, he was.
So the husband is now that the development of the rifle, and I'm curious, I think at this point, let's put some context around, it's been a few months, weeks of investigation. At some point, a trial happens. Can you give us some time frame around, the investigation, how it was going, and then when they decided to make an arrest, and then maybe your involvement in this case and why you were brought in?
Yeah, well, it's cases like these that can really tax the investigators, the prosecutor's office. And I'll say this, I think they did an excellent job, but you don't have any witnesses. It appears that this husband did have a .22 rifle, that may be his, but it's another issue in terms of finding a man guilty and sending him to prison for the rest of his life. The fact that he may be having affairs with co-eds and hanging out in the bars with his fraternity brothers. I think he even stayed at the frat house a few times. But that's all information that is important, I think. But it really did meet the level of, getting a conviction. because it is a difficult case. And very few detectives ever handle something like this. And fortunately, they don't have to handle a lot of them. But I think the investigators in this case did an excellent job. The prosecutor wanted a conviction, but he had a standard in his mind of what they needed to get to, and that just takes time, better than a year.
So from the murder, how long was it before any arrests were made?
I think it was over a year. I don't recall exactly, but he had taken the kids and moved to Colorado. So in addition to making an arrest, they had to extradite him back to Michigan. And what I find unusual, and I tell this to detectives all the time, is that sometimes you have to look at the things that aren't there. If somebody were to kill your wife, you'd be planting yourself in front of the police station demanding that they find out who did it. And you want to know right now. And if they have one detective on it, you'll want 10 detectives working on it. This is a personal loss that's almost immeasurable. But you didn't see any of that. Instead, he's partying, carrying on, and there's a issue in terms of the kids. I think the grandmother wanted custody of the kids, and he didn't want to give her that custody. So eventually, he leaves the state. You almost could look at that as flee.
Right. It seems very suspect that he would just leave.
Exactly. In fact, it's just the opposite. They continue to demand resolution in the case. And here's a guy who was a police officer at one time, not doing that. You would think his instincts as a police officer would be to get more involved, to conduct his own investigation, which is what happens when, I found that other cases where a police officer's wife was murdered, they demand everything.
So what was it that eventually led the investigative and prosecuting team to make an arrest against the husband?
Well, I think it was the totality of things. The fact that it would be very difficult if he's there all day for somebody to get on the property. It'd be very difficult for somebody who didn't know better to get by that Doberman. It'd be very difficult for somebody to get up in that barn and having an idea where she would be standing. And if I remember correctly, I think there was evidence that maybe some test shots were fired into a tree right near where she was going to be getting out of the car. Somebody who didn't know her would have no idea where she's going to park, how she's going to get out of the car, and even if you had a clear shot from the barn. But it's all these little bits of information that come together and say, it's not beyond a shadow of a doubt. It's about having enough probability to say, we're convinced that this guy.
Do you believe that he was responsible for the letter?
Absolutely. I don't think there's any doubt of that.
So do you think that he was responsible for the original stalker call, or that do you think he used that to create a story around it?
Right. I think he took advantage of that because while she initially said that it wasn't that big a deal, she did tell her husband about that call wanting to go to lunch. So I think that he used that and then built this story around it that we've got some kind of stalker after.
And then his plans went awry when he saw that the children were there. He fled. He shoved his gun in a creek, which was the murder weapon. So his premeditated plan kind of fell apart a little bit, didn't it?
Exactly. And, I think it was an overly simplistic plan. I think he drastically underestimated the investigators on the case and fell apart on them. And it's awful difficult once that plan starts to fall apart to, try to salvage things. Quite often you'll see somebody all of a sudden become with other information, like somebody was on my porch last night or somebody tried to break into the barn, things like that. But once this plan started to fall apart, he didn't have a whole lot that he could do. But what was probably the most notable thing to the investigators, and you see this quite often, I believe that the husband in this case was psychopathic. They don't feel bad about what they did. They're narcissistic. The whole world revolves around them. They are unknown in terms of telling the truth. They are consummate liars and consummate actors.
So what do you think was his motivation given that context?
I think that his wife, the victim here, was putting the pressure on him to get a real job, to start supporting the family. And I don't think there's any doubt in his mind that if they went through a divorce, he would lose. He didn't really care for the kids like you would think a father should. They became property. If the grandmother wanted them, then he's not going to let her have them. But, here's a guy who saw that the kids were there. They weren't supposed to be. And then he left them in the car.
So for him, it was about what? Control, power, his ego?
All wrapped up into one, yeah. In fact, I think the investigators noticed right off the bat that when he tried to behave in an emotional fashion, they could tell he was faking it. When it looked like he was crying, he wasn't crying. He was trying to act like he thought people would act when they're crying. But it was obvious.
So you obviously know a lot about this case. When did you enter in as a principal investigator? What was your role in this case? And maybe can you give us some context? As I mentioned in the introduction, you were a detective with the Michigan State Police. Was this being handled by the Michigan State Police, or was it local or county? And what was your involvement?
Yeah, well, the case investigation was primarily the Calhoun County Sheriff's Department. As the case went along, of course, there was a lot of media attention. The public began to get a little upset that it hadn't been solved. And, they thought that maybe this killer could still be roaming around the county. And so there was a decision made to develop kind of a task force. And the detective in charge of that task force was an MSP detective. And his role, of course, was basically organization. My role in the case really was to take a look at all the things, see if they were on the right track or if they had missed something. I think primarily I just let them know that what they had done and how they were doing it was right on target. It's just like, comparing a sprint to a marathon. These are not sprints, they're marathon cases. And you have to go through a lot of steps to make sure that you got the right guy, that you have a case built, that you can get a conviction. And quite often that takes time.
And so this task force, what was your role in the task force? Were you a profiler? Was that your role here?
Yeah, primarily. It wasn't my responsibility, and I try not to do that. I look at myself as more of someone who can help them understand a case like this, to help them see that they're on the right track. I try not to do interviews because then I wind up in court all over the place. But if I can consult with them, basically, maybe I'll see some things that they may want to do a little more work on, or if I see some things that I don't think are going to be, providing any additional information, I might be able to say, probably should put your efforts into another area. But that's my job more often than not, is just as a consultant to tell them, what the personality of the person involved in this, and hopefully it's the right person.
Make sure the investigation is on the right course, that they are, adhering to, experience from people like you, right?
Yeah, and I can tell you, from being a field detective, that if you work a case like this and you worked on it for a long time, you begin to wonder, geez, am I on the right track? Have I missed something? And sometimes it's just nice to hear you're on the right track. You're doing the right thing. Keep going. They are tough, but you're doing right.
So at some point in the investigation, the task force must have kind of collectively said, okay, this is not a random stalker. This is highly likely it's the husband. And so they kind of pivot from that. And then there's a kind of a difference between who done it and then how do we convict them, right? Because that's an important part of the process as well.
The role of an investigator is to seek the truth. And whether that involves a husband or a stranger, you've got to find out what information is available. And if there are things that have to be done, then fine. But you simply are looking for the truth. And the truth is that you're able to supply the prosecutors with the information that they need to take a guy to trial. And if he's responsible, convict.
So let's talk a little bit about the trial. Can you share how the trial went? Were you involved?
There's a case in Calhoun County that was, again, national news. And that's, in this capacity as a profiler, I did not need to testify, which is really only the first time in my career that I was asked to be on the witness list, and was not allowed because the defense attorney thought it unfair. But, I could
Sadly, it was unfair to him if he was trying to win, having you on stand.
Yeah, when, I blame myself. I should have spent some more time with the prosecutor explaining how you can introduce me in terms of my expertise. And I believe in this case, it was said that my testimony would be similar to that of an accident reconstructionist. And that's not true. Those individuals are basically scientific, some of the hard sciences, mathematics, and mine is often referred to as a softer science, psychology, sociology types of information. But I should have done that. I regret not doing that. But it turns out it didn't matter. The right guy was convicted, and the right guy will be spending the rest of his life in prison, even though I believe he still maintains his innocence.
So thankfully, the husband was found guilty of the murder, and he is now in life in prison.
Yes.
Fascinating story. Is there anything about this investigation, this crime, that was significant to your development as an investigator?
I think that every case adds something that I find important. And being involved in better than 10,000 violent crime cases, both as an investigator and as a profiler, you do begin to see some patterns develop. And that really is what profiling is all about and should be all about. I can say to an investigator, when I've seen this before, here's what I found to be true. And I could say that, in a case like this, it tends to be somebody very close, emotionally connected, likely sexually connected in some fashion, and then go through all the personality descriptors, about this age, likely a white male, give them some background information on types of jobs they may have had. Quite often you'll see an individual like this will be involved in kind of a power-oriented profession, and of course the police are just that. But, over the years I've been fortunate enough to work with a great many detectives who do a fantastic job, and I try to learn from every one of those.
Can you provide for our audience who may not really understand what a criminal profiler's role is in an investigation? Can you define that maybe just a little bit for us?
Sure. I often use the term assessment because quite often the term profiler or profile is overused. They know what your shopping profile is. They know what you like to buy on the internet. In terms of being a criminal personality assessor, what you're really looking for is information that will tell you the type of personality that's involved. Now, I can't say that this particular person did it, but I can tell you exactly the kind of person that would do this. And it's up to the investigating officers to say, take that profile, who does it fit? And, for example, one of the most difficult things to profile anymore is chronological age. 100 years ago, a 16-year-old boy was much more mature than a 16-year-old boy is today. They had to get up, they had to do their chores, come in for breakfast, go to school, come home, more chores, do their homework. They had a lot of responsibility. And so the way that I've handled that is I will say developmentally, this person is going to behave like an 18-year-old. Now, they could be 30 years old, but they still live with mom and dad, who does, her laundry, his laundry, cooks all their meals for them. And I can describe the type of car that they might be driving in, things like that. And so what it does is it keeps investigators looking at the most probable individuals in terms of solving the case, not looking at 100 at the same time. Let's take that 100 and list them. Here's the most probable person. And if you can clear that person, then you go to the next one. And I think that's the role that profiling can play and should play in an investigation.
Is there anything else about the case that you thought was unique to your development as an investigator, as in a violent crime, as a detective? Is there anything that stood out about this case that you think was significant to your development as a violent crime investigator?
Yeah, absolutely. This really came quite early in time when I actually became a profiler for the state of Michigan. And, back then, I think what I could have provided was probably very little compared to what I can provide today. Back then, if I had written up a profile, it probably would have been 5 pages long. If I was to do that today, it'd probably be closer to 50. And that's only because I've learned so much more. I have been able to, again, talk with some great investigators. And I think that quite often I'm more interested in what isn't in the report. I'm interested in what bothers them. And they may not be able to articulate it, but I can go in and help them understand why something doesn't make sense. And I think that's the role that profiling should play, is basically as an investigative tool.
Well, thank you for this, Dad. We are coming up on an hour, and I think this was a fantastic first episode so you can dive into this incredibly interesting and terrifying career that you've had investigating violent crimes in Michigan. I'm so thankful that you've been in a position to help put these people behind bars. Very clearly in this case, this is an extremely traumatic event that didn't need to happen. I feel so badly for these 2 children who may not remember, but are probably traumatized by the violent murder of their mother by their father. And so thank you for your work in helping put this person behind bars. And I look forward to our next conversation on your incredible story.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I do appreciate it.
This concludes our first episode of In Pursuit of Darkness, a detective's journey into the violent crimes that have plagued Michigan and the investigation and tools that he's used to find the offenders. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you on our next episode.